Friends and folks, welcome to Kaiju Lounge, your home for humor, opinions, and nerd shit. My guest tonight is a writer and novelist whose debut novel, Kalyna the Soothsayer, became a British Fantasy Award finalist and received acclaim from NPR, Forward, Paste Magazine, and so much more. His follow-up book, Kalyna the Cutthroat, hits shelves as of this video going live tomorrow. And honestly, other than that, the guy's a mystery to me. Please welcome Elijah Kinch Spector to the show. Eli, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. I have enjoyed talking to you since I learned to speak. And so I'm sure I will enjoy this too.
Well, my first question was we've never met before, so I would
Oh, I'm
take that
sorry.
off.
I didn't know you wanted to make it a bit. I'm sorry.
No. Of course, I play with that. But yes, I mean, for the audience at home, this is going to be one of the easiest interviews I've ever done because I have known Eli since preschool. We grew up together. I was the best man at his wedding. His parents raised me almost as much as mine did. Like it's just this is lovely to be. And honestly,
And vice
we
versa.
could just do this in person, but I'm consistent with how I film everything. So here we are.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean the same vice versa in terms of your parents essentially raising me and your brother essentially feeling like my brother when I was a child,
Yeah.
or at least a cousin maybe. I don't know. You both. What exactly? It's hard to say.
Yeah,
But
I
yeah,
think
we've known each
it
other
just
since.
kept you short of only child syndrome, I think, you know?
Right. Exactly. I've still got a lot of that though. Uh,
I mean, Eli, I there's plenty of reasons to have you on here, but the big one right now is Kalyna the Cutthroat.
yes.
The sequel to Kalyna the Soothsayer, which I have here, is coming up. I mean, it's getting two books out in a fairly short amount of time to each other. Let's go into it for anyone who is jumping in and doesn't know much about the series. Talk a little bit about what it's all about, who is Kalyna, and what can they expect from this book.
Sure. Well, the first thing to point out is that Kalyna the Cutthroat, which is the second book, and Kalyna the Soothsayer, the first book, are both are connected, but can each be read completely as a standalone. The second book was written to work as a standalone. If you read the first book, you will understand some things about characters and events in a different light, but each book can be read on its own and is a complete story. The series overall is largely a way to look at first Kalyna as a character who is this a con artist who is from a family of people who all have actual power of prophecy. They're able to see the future. It has a lot of limits. It's very painful in a lot of ways, but they're able to do it, and that is how they have made their living forever. And she can't. She just doesn't have the power. She just didn't get it. And spoilers, she never surprise gets it at the end. And she's a con artist, so she has to fake it. And then her as a con artist is used to explore what I love about secondary world fantasy, fantasy not set on Earth, not set in the past, etc. You know, like Tolkien, etc. Is you can use it to explore a lot of things. And one thing that I feel like we don't do enough of is exploring different kinds of government and the way they would work. And I don't mean that in terms of how the people at the top are. I mean in terms of how they affect people at the bottom and in the middle. And Kalyna the Soothsayer and Kalyna the Cutthroat are both different ways of looking at how different kinds of governments could work or might work, and how those would affect the individuals who are most vulnerable in them. Well, also there are monsters and sword fights and intrigue and spies. To be clear, they are fun books also.
Well, no, but that's one of the things I think that draws so many people to fantasy, right? Is not so much. I mean, yes, there is the fantasy element of it, but also the best stories are, at times allegories at the very least. Like they are able to explore very real things in a very different setting. And I think that's something that that's why people really get into it, not because you know giant ships and dragons and shit is nice and everything, but it doesn't hold weight if there's not a human element to it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's very true. And look, there aren't any dragons in these books, although I'm not saying I'll never write a book with a dragon in it, because I love them. Uh, but yes, it's a chance to see how somebody from a completely different place, who they would be, how that world would shape them. And and the thing I think that sometimes disappoints me about some secondary world fantasy is that it is almost always about the same sort of feudal medieval Europe sort of thing. And obviously that's been much less true over the last, I mean, it's never been fully the case, and it is becoming less and less the case, which is great. But certainly another chance to sort of look at, a lot of it is a lot of fantasy is very much set in the Middle Ages, right? And which
Yeah.
is great. But my books are a little more 18th century, which I did in part because the 18th century is when a lot of weird ideas came up, right? That's when people came up with this country, which,
Weird
and
idea. Yeah.
uh, it's certainly, no matter what you're feeling on the United States of America at the time, it was a weird idea.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and like many Enlightenment ideas and all these sorts of things were going on, and that's only in Europe and then moving to the U.S. through colonization, but and then so in Kalyna the Cutthroat, what I wanted to explore a bit of was utopianism, because there's a really fascinating history of utopian groups in the United States in like the mid 19th century. So this is pre a lot of what we would consider capital C communism, pre Marx, etc.
Mhm.
And a lot of them are sort of like proto hippies in some ways, or which also is something that I am fascinated with for reasons related to the fact that Noah and I have known each other our entire
Yes.
lives.
Yes.
Um, um, but because yeah, so I yes, we were both raised within proximity of a lot of hippies and countercultural types.
Very, very much
Um,
so. Yes, it was the
yeah,
the hippie
um,
elephant graveyard where they all kind of go to just get old and die.
pretty much. And so I wanted to explore these sort of these groups that they were mid 19th century is a time that's very sort of socially in Western society is a time that's very socially repressed. And so
Okay.
seeing the ways in which these different groups would break out of it in one way, but maybe not another, or, go too far in how they pushed back on something and all these kinds of things was really, really interesting. While also wanting to look at the fact that, like, they were in like the 19th century America and Europe, where a lot of them were from, were not great places to be in a lot of ways, and trying to make a better one is laudable even if you make mistakes. And that's also kind of what I wanted to show in the book, is to not show the people who have utopian ideas as just crackpots, but also not just have it be a utopia story that in which everything's fixed.
Right. 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 It allows. You don't want. I want to avoid saying both sidesisms, but it does allow a little bit
Right.
of being able to kind of, you know, where see where the pendulum swings and when it swings both
Right.
ways. Uh,
And to
let's
be
talk.
clear, it is not both. Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
both
Yes.
sides. Even
Yes.
though I
No.
definitely have strong opinions, but but I mean, what it is in each book I get to use adventure and fantasy and magic and all these fun things to also explore the ways that certain kinds of societies can alienate people and other people and oppress people and what how they respond, and also to sometimes fantasize ways that they can respond that are a little better than what we have in real
Than
life.
the way than how they actually respond at times.
Well, then how
Speaking
we're
of
able
everyone's
to
favorite
ever.
subject, government, let's talk a little bit about within the world buildings. You talk about being able to explore different types and how they affect people. Uh, how like what is your especially when you are you're building this world from kind of your own idea and having and making politics such a big approach, how do you approach coming up with a political system or rival political systems in something like this? Because one thing to be like, I'm going to make up a fantasy world. It's like, okay, you get the map, you get, loosely what is it based off of. Politics seems like a whole different beast to approach when it comes to fantasy.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's always been something I've thought about a lot. But like, again, when I say politics, I feel like our wording is limited because politics is often referring to politicians, and that's
Fair, fair.
but the way in which that everything is political, and I a lot of it is honestly just ripping off history. Like, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a very real country that existed where Poland and Lithuania were just kind of mashed together into one country. And they each had, I think, no, there was one king for the whole thing, but he was elected. The king was
Hmm.
elected. This is like, I want to say 15, 16, 17, maybe a little later. 18th century, around there. A little anyway. And the king was elected, although only by the nobles, not like by everybody. But still, the king was elected, and so it's just this bizarre thing that was in some ways very democratic, but also, like a lot of places in Eastern Europe, was basically based on slave labor. So it wasn't that, in other ways, it's very bad. And so that I think is the kind of thing that really interests me. Is something that's like so different that it's not better or worse, or maybe it isn't, maybe it is, but you have to really dig in and see if how. Um, but then I didn't have more there. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. No, it's. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. Different areas to take inspiration from, and I use that as a very coded way of leaning into something we were talking about before we started recording. Was that a lot of our childhood and a lot of our
Yes.
love growing up surrounded video games, very much so. And I think it's funny because we talk. I've seen a lot of interviews. I've seen a lot of things. We're talking with fantasy writers, talk about where their inspiration is coming from. Comics. Sometimes it's pulled straight from people's D&D games, stuff like that.
Right.
You know, we don't typically hear about the inspirations from the video game side. They have to assume we're all a bunch of nerds. Like there's got to be
Right.
some of that in there, and you specifically. I think more so. I got into it a little bit later, but more so because you had the PlayStation, and there wasn't a lot coming out for the 64 from my end. RPGs of
Yes.
specifically that era. And so let's talk a little bit like what inspirations, if any, from those has that leaked into a lot of your fantasy writing or just in generally your proclivities when it comes to creativeness.
Oh, extremely. This is why you're the interviewer, because that would have been where to start, and then I could talk about the politics later. But and draw people in.
Yeah.
But I mean, honestly, if there are two big poles that a lot of my work come from, it is probably reading about weird old history and having played a lot of JRPGs. There's definitely some of that in there. Not in terms of the sort of some of the bigger crazy, not in terms of a Final Fantasy 9999 hit points kind of thing,
Right.
so much.
You're not killing
But
God in a mech or anything like that,
No,
but
no, 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 not quite. I mean, a big one that I know you watched me play one of the many times I played it was Suikoden II. The first one is great as well, but it was very much like Suikoden 1 was, I think, like it was almost the first JRPG for PS1, or it was the first one in English, or some. It was the first one,
it was
something.
very
Uh,
early. Yeah.
right, and it's short and it's easy. Well, parts of it aren't, but parts of it are. Um, but what I liked about it, and what I think really does actually influence my work hugely, is the politics of it.
Yeah, no.
But the fact that the politics of it also had all these goofy ass fantasy characters in it, right? Because the thing about the Suikoden games, right, is that every Suikoden game, the sort of hook of them is that there's 108 characters that you can recruit. And so they really got to fill that roster out as they go on. And so
Yes.
you got all kinds of weird people. You got some elves, you got some kobolds, although their kobolds are more like little wolf men. I don't know enough about D&D to know if that's a D&D thing also or not, but
Not
um
exactly. I mean, like they always refer to them as kind of like dog like, but they've always been tiny dragon creatures. Which
yeah,
is why
I,
and Suikoden's the only one that's used kobolds as dogmen, and I don't know why. I think there
is it a
might be something to.
translation thing, I wonder?
Well, I think it came from when getting off topic here, when Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was released in
Yeah.
Japan, it had its own separate art.
Yeah.
And everything like that. And I think there was a little bit lost in translation. Dog like has been used to describe kobolds, and so there might have
Hmm.
been something like that worked in. And so, anything that took in a lot of JRPGs took its inspiration from D&D coming
Right.
from the West over there. So I think that is a part of it. I think there's probably just a translation, but not necessarily in uh, the gaming industry itself, specifically in TTRPGs making its way over.
That's fascinating. Anyway, I just think that's really interesting.
Oh yeah.
So Suikoden. So you've got these little dog kobolds. You've got dwarves. You've also random other things. I'm not even remembering what all of them were now.
Weren't
There
there
was a
like
giant
two
squid in
giant
two.
crab? Oh, there were two giant squids, right?
There was a maybe. Boy, I don't remember. There was a unicorn. So some of these big monsters actually took up two people's space in the party, which was amazing. But anyway, the point is because they had to, so. But the other thing about the Suikoden games is that they sort of seemed, in a way that a lot of JRPGs don't, to plan ahead to be able to tell more stories. So the first game doesn't show you the whole world. You play a Final Fantasy game, and I love Final Fantasy. Like that's where I started, like most people. But
Yeah.
you play a Final Fantasy game, by the end you've seen the entire world and you've killed God or whatever. And in Suikoden, at the end it was, you had really explored like a country and a few other surrounding places, and it was about politics, and but it also, you still did fight a giant six-headed, like, lion dragon guy at the end, and it still was a big JRPG. But like, and the castle still fell apart. Spoilers, I guess.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
like, you were left going, oh, other things could happen here. What even is that city state that they mentioned that we never even see, but we saw soldiers from in like one scene? What's that? And you start, and there are like hints of things which JRPGs didn't usually do. And the thing about Suikoden 2 is it delivers on a lot of them really, really well. There are some that they kept pulling along throughout the series, and some that I think will never get resolved because of that. But also at the end of the day, not everything needs to be resolved in a story.
No.
Um, but Suikoden 2 just like really ratcheted up the character drama and the politics, while also ratcheting up all the crazy fun bullshit, right? Like 2 is the one that has a series of cooking competitions. A series of
Right.
cooking
Yes.
competitions
Yes.
in which your cook is being chased by the evil, well, not chased, but he has been found now by the remnants of the evil cook association he used to be part of, and you have to do the mini game for the cooking. But also sometimes one of your opponents, when he dies, eats when he loses, eats poison and kills himself. Like, it's so intense, but it's also so silly because you're doing a little cooking mini game, and the judges are randomly chosen members of your 108 people that you've recruited, who all have different tastes. And it's
Right.
so silly, and and you learn so much about their characters in this silly little thing that is also still infused with the like larger sort of political themes of the larger story, which is that friends can be turned against each other and people who were allies can be turned against each other, which is most of what Suikoden 2 is about. So yeah.
No, I mean, yeah, it's truly is one of those games I feel like, getting re-released, but in general does not get the love it deserves because like,
Oh well, yeah.
it had like what, 5 games in the end?
Five, I think. Yeah, I think five. I think
Definitely
there
4. I
was a
don't know
there
how.
there was a five. I played five. I remember five. There was then a there was some like thing with the name that was like something else that I think was for 3DS or something. I'm not sure. I
They
think it
also
was
started
something
doing the
else,
whole
but
Arc the Lad thing where like every game started taking place like in 20,000 years in the future and shit like that. Like
right. That was so part of what was so cool about Suikoden 2 also at the time was it was the first time I had ever played a video game where I could import a save from the previous game.
yes.
I know that on
Yes.
PC people could do that already, but I wasn't able to play PC games, even though my father worked for PC World magazine. Uh, well, honestly, that's why, because he knew how much trouble it would be to make that computer play games in the 90s, and he
Yes,
didn't want
right,
to do
right.
it. And I don't blame him, having spent some years of my adulthood trying to be a PC gamer. Oh, it's like God bless you, those of you who are able to do it.
It's
Um,
easier now than it ever was when we were kids. Lord
that's
knows.
true.
Like
That's true.
even just fucking installing Warcraft 2 was an experience.
My poor father did, however, actually manage to get installed Super Street Fighter II Turbo for PC for me,
Oh,
um, which I don't know if you remember this. Here's the thing: I never got a controller, so I learned how to do them all, do all the moves on the fucking on
the keyboard.
the keyboard, the arrow keyboard, including super moves. It was insane. I wasn't good at it, but I could play the computer at least. Anyway, sorry, that is
Yes.
way afield. But
No, this is
um,
the early days of SNES emulation where I had to play things the same way there too.
right. Oh God, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've never pirated something in my life.
No, of course, never, never, never.
So importing the saves gave this feeling of continuity that was like so new to me and incredible. And in the later Suikoden games, they it switched console generations, and they could only do so much. You could import save data into 3 from PS1 to PS2, but it only affected a few lines of dialogue. It wasn't anything
Yeah.
beyond that, I think. Um, but in 2, it's like if you import your save data from 1, spoilers, I guess, you get to use the main character from the first game, and he's as powerful as you think he'd be.
Yes.
It's
Mind
wild.
blowing. It was an amazing
And
experience.
so thinking about that just also made me realize, actually bring it back to my book in a way I wasn't even planning,
Let's
which
go. I love
is,
this.
okay, so Kalyna the Soothsayer, the first book, is in first person from Kalyna's perspective. She is the main character, she is the narrator, you're very much in her head. Um,
Hmm.
for the second book, she is still the main character, but I didn't want to do that again because it's only set a few years later, and I thought it would be kind of repetitive, both for the reader and for me. So book 2 is from someone else's perspective, and Kalyna is the main character, but she is not the lead. She is not the narrator. It's more like a Holmes and Watson kind of thing, right?
Interesting.
Um, and so because of that, there's a bit of dramatic, there's the dramatic tension of, like, for the reader, of when will she show up. And I won't say when she does. It's not that far in. Her name is on the cover. But I didn't realize until after I'd written it, but the scene that introduces her is actually very similar to the scene where you come
See,
across the hero from the first game in the second game. That is actually definitely 100% true. And I did realize it later and go, that wasn't on purpose, but subconsciously, that was absolutely what I was doing.
that is fantastic. I
So
love that.
there we go.
How was that? Did you find that a difficult shift, or was it easy because you were ready for it? Moving, telling a story about this character, but moving the perspective of how it's told.
Um, it was very easy. It was what I wanted to. I mean, obviously parts of it were hard, but
Right.
as a decision, it felt like the only one. Like for one thing, the first book, I wrote most of the bones of it. The first final draft of it was finished in 2014. I started it
Right.
in 2012. And then, I put it away, and then I edited it more, and then I put it away, and then I edited it more. But by the time it came out, obviously I did edits. I did a round or two of edits before it came out. It was pretty intense edits with my editor that made it a much better book. But the bones of it had all been written almost a decade before it came out, because it came out in 2022. And so honestly, going back to that voice would have been hard. Like, she would have only aged
That's
three
valid.
years. I had aged 10. Um, and so, like, it's not for nothing that the narrator of the new book is closer to my age, for one thing. But um, it had been a long time. And going back to that voice, that it felt repetitive, like I mentioned, and also, like, I think as a reader it would have been repetitive.
Right.
But also, I really, because she's a con artist. This was the other main reason why I did the switch, because she's a con artist. I figured it would be really good to show her from the outside and show how good she is at it, right? Because in the first book, you see how good she is at it because you see the events, but you were seeing her inner monologue. You see how insecure she is. You see how she's making shit up as she goes along. You see how she's just trying her best and isn't sure and is just hoping it works, right? And so in the second book, you get to see her from the point of view of somebody who has just met her and thinks, "Wow, she's got it all. She's got it all figured out. This is amazing." And if you've read the first book or you've listened to this interview, you know that she doesn't. If you haven't,
Right.
you might start to pick that up as you go. But either way, it provides some dramatic irony and a way to show her from the outside, and to do something different. The first book was to look at what she's like on the inside, and this is more, again, like Holmes and Watson, or it's actually more like Raffles the Gentleman Thief, which was written by, I think, Arthur Conan Doyle's brother-in-law,
Oh,
but
really?
but is a very similar sort of thing, except that Raffles is such an early gentleman thief that his code is not that good, and he's pretty awful, and I kind of love it. Um,
Yeah, I guess that's a fair point. If you're going to show con artists, what better way of showing them pulling the wool over people's eyes than not being inside their head, right? Like, imagine,
Right.
did you find? I can only speak from my point of view as someone who's not a writer. That trying to do that, I'd have to catch myself a couple of times to kind of say, "Wait, no, because I know this character, I'm now putting in too much subtext." Did you find yourself having to pull back a little bit because you're trying to pull the wool over characters' eyes?
Yeah, definitely. Writing a second book that is, well, as I mentioned, meant to work as a standalone,
Mm,
and in which the main character, you're not in the main character's head. It can be hard sometimes to remember, oh, the reader doesn't know this or that, and it can be difficult to not, yeah, overdo things or underdo it, to not either give away too much or to be so scared of giving away too much they don't give away enough. Because the thing about anything, in writing, if you're doing a mystery or anything with twists, like my books aren't technically mysteries, but there's a lot of twists and surprises in them.
right.
um and it is, you don't want to fully surprise the reader, because then they're just like, well, that came out of nowhere. You need to seed it a little bit. I mean, honestly, I think the if I was a, I think I was able to manage it because of my editors. My editor Sarah Guan, who worked on the first book, and who worked on most of the second book, and then my editor Wingsamai Fetters, who did a few rounds on the last book, maybe one round. What and the so Sarah's a really great editor and had worked on the first book. Wingsamai came to the second book not having read the first book, so that was an
Oh.
editor who could look at it from the point of view of a new reader, which was really useful. So yeah, so like, as much as writing a novel is an extremely, in many ways, a very solitary pursuit, it is also still extremely not done alone. Because boy, neither of these books would be readable without my editors.
You know, it's like yeah, I can only equate it to video editing. It's like they're doing their job when you can't tell they're there, but doesn't mean that their effects aren't
Exactly.
felt, right? Like that's always an important
Exactly.
thing.
You
You
should really
mentioned
put in a
having
really awkward cut right now.
and no, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but you mentioned having started the process on this first book in 2012.
Yeah.
So a lot of time passed from that and the book's initial release. Was there What surprised you? Because I'm assuming that there was some times taken and then come back to it, right? Whatever the
Mhm.
longest gap of that was, what surprised you in revisiting your own writing during that time?
Well, so throughout that time, there would be sometimes I'd go away for a year or two, would come back, do edits. Um, I think right at the end, right at the very end, I had finished my edits with my editor. We were in copy edits, and I had done all the copy edits. And there was one last like proof that was sent to me, and I went, you know what? I don't think I've actually read this whole thing word for word in maybe 8, 9 years, maybe 6, 7, but like a long time. Because realistically, when I would be editing, I'd go, okay, what parts do I think need this? Like look around, skim. Like, why would I read the whole thing over again? I mean, I know why, but I wouldn't.
Yeah, right,
Um,
right.
and so, and so it was the first time that I read the whole thing front to back. And I mean, the main thing, honestly, this is going to sound very like, but like honestly, I was surprised that it was any good. I had been going insane over it for so long that I was like, I like this.
Yeah.
But in terms of specifics, I think what surprised me was there were a few little moments that I found where it wasn't anything where like a moment that it clearly was like so small that I'd never passed over it. I'd never like looked at it carefully in a very long time. That would just be not even anything like bad, but just sort of like, oh, that's not how I would say that anymore. And I don't even mean that in terms of like the correct terminology. I just mean in terms of like, okay. So like literally, like I'd written it so long ago that my thinking was more binary on gender, and there were times where I was just like, like the book is still set in a world because I wrote it in 2012 or started writing in 2012. That first book is set pretty much in a world where like there's pretty much two genders, although transgender does exist in the transgender people do exist in the book, but I didn't have a good idea of non-binariness in 2012, which is fair. Um, I hope. But
No,
reading it again, I
I
sort of
think
had these
so. I think
moments.
there's been,
Yeah,
I think we can honestly say there's been a level of cultural awareness. You don't want to say that
yeah,
none of it didn't exist, but like it was a level of cultural
right,
awareness that we've been, lucky to have kind of our eyes open to and be far more aware of. And like, you know, wish that wasn't the case, but you know,
right,
the culture catches up a little slowly,
right.
but it
And
does.
so right. And so again, it wasn't anything bad. It was just little moments where it's like, oh, I could word that slightly differently and then it would be less binary. And why not? Because, you know, um, so like that was sort of one sort of little moment like that. And then a nice thing about the second book being pretty different, because the second book is also set in parts of the world. This is actually another thing that goes back to Suikoden a little bit, because the second book is set in parts of the world that are mentioned, but you don't really see in the first book, just like in Suikoden 1,
Here we go.
Suikoden 2.
Perfect.
um, but what that also meant, and then I also bring in a bit from another place that you don't really see, but you have people from that place in the world of the book. And in the second book, much more, and that gave me a chance to go. Well, I didn't fully decide what those cultures' ideas of gender were, so they can be a little. I can be a little more loose, and I can find a few more ways, and then to allow that in ways that don't feel like pushing it, like forcing it, right? Um, yeah,
That's great. No, and it must be kind of fun to be able to sort of play in the it's a sandbox of your own making, but it's still fun to kind
yep,
of find places to discover some of those aspects and kind of jump into it. And I think
absolutely.
we've been very lighthearted talking about sort of the effects of gaming and stuff and the fantasy aspect. But you have brought in parts of your real life in there. There's a real it's a very queer aspect to it that I think is very strong. I know you've made sure to have
Mm.
through some of your writing, and also a very culturally Jewish identity in this as well. Both of us having grown up Jewish in the Bay Area, which is kind of always a mixed bag because it is both there's both a level of traditional as well as a we're not going to be traditional kind of combined
Right,
in a
right.
lot of that. Do you find that was just kind of always the case? Like, yes, write what you know sort of aspect there, and it just kind of came out that way, or do you feel that it was kind of a mission to come in and be like, I want to make sure that these themes feel represented in here?
So there are different answers for the Jewish one and the queer one. And
Fair enough.
also there's a separate neurodivergent answer that I also could give you, or I could do all three.
Let's do
In
it.
terms of queerness, the fun thing is the first book helped me realize I was queer, because I didn't learn that until I was an adult. And so the Kalyna, the main character of both books, and the narrator of the first book, is bisexual. And I, at the time, just thought, well, yeah, I'll make her bisexual. That makes the most sense. I mean, everyone wants to be deep down, right? That must be, yeah, right? So, like, that's what I'll do. I'm straight, I thought. But like, yeah, right. And then what's funny is, though, of course, the queerness in the first book is, well, there are gay male characters in the first book as well, but when it is through Kalyna, the queerness, of course, involves female characters. But in having her sort of describe what was attractive about men, and not just physically, but generally, but also physically, it sort of like helped me sort of unlock that a bit, and I did sort of figure that out while I was writing that first book. Um, and then in the second book is just much gayer, much gayer than the first book.
Yes.
I researched historical lubes for the second book.
Oh, fun.
Um, Unfortunately, the answer is mostly just vegetable oil. Everyone just used like olive
Oh,
oil, vegetable
oh,
oil. Like
boom.
that's all people use
Okay.
for lube. Yeah, it's not that interesting, unfortunately. Um, in terms of
Unless
Jewishness,
there's like a
well,
race of like mushroom people or vegetable people that are running around, then you guys have some real fun things to play with.
that's not quite the world of these books.
I know, I
But you know what? But like I feel like there is maybe a novella in there, so I'll think about that. Uh, Actually, let me do neurodivergent next, because I think Jewish
yeah.
just makes sense to do finally. But in terms of neurodivergence, I also didn't know that when I was writing the first book. I thought I did not know I had ADHD until the book was sold and I was doing edits. Actually, like pretty much all the writing of the first book, I didn't know I had ADHD.
Hmm.
And I had a moment thinking about when it was time to start doing PR for the first book, of thinking about the basic concept of the fact that Kalyna doesn't have this power that everyone else in her family has. And then I realized, oh my God, that's just literally being it was even after edits. All edits were done. The book was completely in the can. It was completely done. And this was when I realized, oh, it's everyone in your family has a superpower that you don't. That's literally, why can't you ever get up on time? Why can't you ever do your homework? Why can't you pay attention in class? Why can't you pay attention when I'm talking to you, etc., etc., etc.
Right.
And I realized, like, oh shit, that's literally what it is. That's what the concept was. I'm so glad I didn't know it until the book was done, because it would have been so corny if I had done that on purpose.
I
But
love that both of
thankfully
you
I
have
didn't.
kind of been a bit of a
Right.
write what you know, you just didn't know you knew it until
Writing's interesting that way. Jewishness, obviously, that one I did not need to learn. That is central to the work, because I mean, the thing I often say is, like, I have a lot of very strong identities, but like Jew is at the top, way like above everything else, like gender, writer, anything. It's just like the way I view the world, in
Yeah.
many ways. And so it's very central to both books, in that in that I'm interested in oppression. I'm interested in the politics of oppression. I'm interested in what it does to people. And that sounds like a bummer, but it can also, like, I was also raised on, like Robin Hood stories, right? Where it's like about fighting oppression. Like, that's
Right.
what good adventure stories are to me. Um, and so, like, no, it's a secondary world fantasy. Nobody in the books is Jewish, but Kalina's very Jewish in a lot of ways, and culturally, and also the setting of the book. The setting of the first book is mostly like sort of Central and Eastern Europe, and the second book moves out of that in partly to sub-Saharan Africa, which is also very cool, although less Jewish, although not entirely, not, but and then also Central Asia, which of course also has a very long history of like Jewish people being there. And that wasn't on purpose, but these are places, A, that interest me because I read about them, because I'm, interested in my Jewishness, and B, uh, because shit, what was B? Oh no. Uh, Um, oh, and also B, because they are places that are not in fantasy, at least English language fantasy, that often. And so
Yeah.
I was interested, and this is also true for the sub-Saharan Africa section of book two as well. And so my Jewishness very much, it infuses it in terms of like the way I think about oppression, and the way I think about how we deal with it, and the way I think about um, well, and the sorts of personalities that can come out of it. And then in the second book also ends up being to a large degree about ethnic cleansing, and refugees. Again, I promise it's also fun, but it is also about that. And that was something that I was thinking when I was writing it. I was thinking both about the history of ethnic cleansing carried out against our ancestors in Europe, and also
Mhm.
the ethnic cleansing carried out by other Jews in Palestine against Palestinians. And those are both things that are on my mind as examples of that I am unfortunately connected to in very different ways.
Right.
Um, so it's always part of it, in every way. I don't know how to see the world a different way. But of course the old joke, what do you get when you have three Jews? Four opinions. So my version of Jewishness is completely different from anybody else's.
Right.
So,
Right. No, I mean, absolutely. It's like anything else. It's not just one thing. I mean, much like fantasy, and like I think you bring up something. You mentioned this earlier, and we're kind of circling around it. The idea of that, like a lot of fantasy has historically been one thing. Medieval Europe,
mm,
very
right.
very Tolkien-esque, and everything is kind of in the same way that a lot of sci-fi was very Star Wars, and people have trouble
Yeah.
breaking from that. Um, and I personally believe that we all are kind of products for society. It's just how well we can kind of shunt those things off. It can be hard because if that's what we've seen and grown up with, even a lot of the JRPGs that we grew up
Mhm.
loving come from that. Um, knowing that you didn't want this to take place there, were there any sort of like traps that you found yourself, tropes that you like? Yeah, I gotta right the ship again. Gotta turn this way, because it can be easy when the first thoughts in our head, and it's no one's fault in the society, comes to a very specific idea of fantasy.
I'm not sure because in the first book, well, the thing is, like, I think that I, if anything, when I was writing the first book all those years ago, probably what I was trying to do was not be too aggressively being anti everything in fantasy because I was like in my 20s and like kind of thought it was dumber than I do now in some ways. Not
Yeah.
all of it, but like that, like now I'm very much like, I also love the classic fantasy a lot. And I always did, but I had a while where I was more sort of angry about it. And that's not by the, like, that doesn't really, that's not reflected in the book as a final, but I think in the early drafts, I think I was almost trying to be trying to go against too many things. And then I
A little
sort of was like, oh, this,
anti-establishment in a way.
right. Well, this is again, like being raised in sort of anti-establishment, countercultural situations. Right. Um, so yeah, it's really more, I'm sure there probably was, but nothing that comes to mind. Yeah.
Well, let's also talk about something else that was that, like, before this, before the Kalyna series, you had a book you were working on. Where it was, sort of a swashbuckling thing that you had been working on for a bit.
Yes.
A while ago. You aim towards this instead. This is the book that's been released.
Mhm.
That was you. We've talked on our own about that being part of your past. Have been elements of like your love of swashbuckling. I obviously it drove you to initially go for that book in the first place. You bring up Robin Hood before. Like, are there elements from that, that first attempt that you kind of see, that you got to play around with again in here as well, be able to reuse some ideas?
Boy, an interview with someone who's known you since preschool. Wow.
I,
Do you remember what it was called? Pop
I
quiz. Do you
don't.
remember what it was called?
I was really trying to hunt it
Tough.
down because I was like, fuck, I wanted to bring that up in the opening line too when I
Of course,
didn't.
of course you would. Of course you would. Um, I mean, I think any writer should cannibalize their old work that doesn't go out. Absolutely, 100%. Like I don't know if there's one direct like plot thing, certainly, but like that first book especially, although there's a fair share in the second book too, has a lot of people with rapiers having sword fights. Like that's
Mm.
just a thing I love. Yeah, I was yeah, my dad, so my dad, who Noah of course knows very well,
Yes,
um
yes, yes.
uh when my parents decided they were going to let me see, this is also again very like hippie shit, right? When my parents decided they were going to let me see violent movies, they decided they didn't want to show me violent movies with guns at first. And so they started with things like Robin Hood, and like I mean like the old one from the 30s and a lot of old 30s and 40s swashbucklers. And so Robin Hood
Mhm.
and Zorro, it was one or the other, is probably the first thing I really remember like watching in that way. And so like here I am still writing people were books where people have now writing books where people have sword fights over oppression. um but so like certainly, I mean, I love I love the swashbuckler archetypes. I mean, I've got my little gay 30s mustache, like, I love that sort of thing so much. There's just that, I think what I love so much about it, beyond just that like sword fights are cool and like old movie stars are charismatic, is again this like, it feels like, and this is, I guess, also what fantasy can do. You look at a movie from the 30s, like Robin Hood, and then you look at another movie from the 30s that's set in the modern era that's about gangsters, say. That will
Mhm.
end with the gangsters dying, right? And obviously the gangsters are bad because they're gangsters, but like they're also being done in the 30s, especially in the early 30s, they're definitely being done as sort of like a folk hero that they also want you to like. But because
Yeah.
it's the modern era, they have to die at the end. Robin Hood gets to rob and kill and gets to kiss the girl and like go off and be fine at the end. And fix everything. And I mean, like, spoilers, England wasn't actually fixed
No.
in, in the reign of Richard the Lionheart, of
Yeah,
all
yeah,
people. He was barely there. But and he also, I don't think he spoke English. But anyway, but our secondary world fantasy as we think of it existed then but was not in the popular consciousness, and so swashbucklers were almost kind of a sideways universe, right? That's sort of a fantasy version. It's
Mm.
not, Zorro basically solves racism in California, in Spanish California. That didn't happen, you know. But it's fun, and it's fun, and sometimes those stories can really lean into that, the sort of social justice thing, and sometimes they don't, and they can be fun either way. Um, but I think that kernel of like, you know, in a modern story, it feels like a lot of the time the world can only be changed by the villain, you
Mm,
know,
yeah.
or it's going to be, and then the hero stops them. And this is even true in a lot of stories in other settings. But I'm not saying that the whole world gets remade at the end of my book, but I think that there's more of a chance to let people, to give your hero the agency to actually do things, and like in that way, it is still, even though my work is can be about very dark things, it's still escapism to some degree. You know, it's not everything's fine and everything's fixed forever in the way that, say, Robin Hood is. But you know, I think walking that line between like being fun and adventurous and letting us have a catharsis that we wouldn't get in
Yeah.
real life, with also exploring some real things and not shortchanging those real things, is that's the
Right. Well,
balance I'm trying to.
I
Yeah.
think we as a society have moved from the classic Hollywood endings of everything's happy and the music swells as it pans out and the end shows up, right? Like we've moved beyond that for something a little more nuanced, and I think there's always going to be an appetite for that. But I also think that
Yeah.
you've defended a couple of times the idea that the book's still fun. It is. I think I think you have dark themes because a hero needs something dark to overcome, right? The hero needs a reason to rise up, and I think you've absolutely found some really interesting ways to bring let your hero and bring them in and rise up. Um, I want to go into one more thing that I'd be curious to see if this is you feel that this has been influenced in your writing as well. Another big love of yours,
Ooh,
which we don't often hear
I'm
fantasy
curious.
writers having, is hip hop. Uh,
Yes.
you've always been a big fan for a long
Yes.
time, and it's something that from an outsider's perspective could seem somewhat counter to the genre that you happen to write in. What thoughts on me even saying that, let alone whether or not you feel like there's been some influence that in your creativity?
Uh, I mean, there isn't a genuine isn't a general sense in that I care a lot about good prose, and I care about good rhythm in writing, and I don't just mean that in terms of like, because you know, rap music is so much about like, not just about being music and having rhythm in that sense, but in terms of like the how you're using syllables. You know, like honestly, the thing I always used to, when I was a kid and I was trying to be a little rebellious about it, like what I was telling my dad is like, you raised me on Shakespeare and Gilbert and Sullivan. Like, what did you think I was going to like? You know, like, you know, in
You're
terms
not
of,
wrong.
obviously, in terms of the content, it's completely different. In terms of how it sounds, I'm not trying to be like, that was the original rapping. Like, no, 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 no. But, but
You gotta
absolutely
sit on
not.
your chair
But,
backwards if you're going to say that.
oh God, absolutely not. Not in 1,000 years. But, point is just, I was raised to really care about the syllables and the, you know, the how you use them and the rhythm of them, and that's part of why I like rap music, and that probably does influence my writing in some ways. And also just a general anti-authoritarian, or anti-authority rather, and anti-authoritarian, but you know, anti-authority,
Right.
anti-establishment sort of a thing. But yeah, like, you know, I'm certainly not trying to, I don't want anyone to read my 18th century fantasy and go, yeah, this guy definitely likes rap music, because those things just don't like go together, you know. Like, it shouldn't be obvious from reading it, unless
Right.
I used it as an epigraph, which I didn't happen to do. I do actually quote one song secretly, so actually I quote two songs secretly in certain places, but so secretly that I don't think anyone will ever catch them. So
I love
go
that.
find it,
If
and
yeah, if you read the book, if you catch them, drop them in the
yeah,
comments. Let's see if
yeah.
you figure it out. Eli will confirm or deny based on that. But until then, you have to find it out for yourself. It's the great treasure hunt of Kalyna the Cutthroat. Um,
No, those are in Soothsayer. I'm
oh,
actually
those
not
were
sure there are any in Cutthroat. Yeah, no, actually, I'm not sure there are any like that in That's the thing. When you spend 10 years on a book, you have more time to put in Easter eggs. You know, you write a book in 2 years, fewer Easter eggs. That's
it's
fine. Easter
about.
eggs aren't what's important.
um, Great. So we're coming kind of to the close now, but I just want to know, this book, it releases as of us airing the video tomorrow, or already out based on when you're watching this. What can you talk about as for you? What's next? Both as far as what does the promotion of this book is out look like for you, but also where we go from here.
Yeah. Well, in terms of promotion, yes, it is out tomorrow, November 26th, in hardcover and ebook. The audiobook will be coming in December. Also, very cool. The audiobook will actually have two voice actors. They brought back the voice actor who was Kalyna, who did read the first one as Kalyna, to do just a little bit at the end of the second book, which is very
Oh, I
cool.
love that. That's great.
Yeah, and I think actually do some little interlude bits as well, actually. So that's very cool. Um, and then if you were in New York City, um, December 4th at PNT Knitwear, I will be doing an event with Micaiah Johnson, who is the amazing author of The Space Between Worlds, and I am forgetting which awards she has won, but she definitely has some. Um, but and she's great. We're friends, and we much like you, somebody that I like to talk to a lot. So I'm looking forward to talking to her in front of an audience.
That's awesome.
Um, in terms of anything of what's next, it's nothing I can talk about yet. But I am working on a thing,
That's
on a
great.
thing that will actually, on a thing that will not be directly connected to any music that I like, but that I might be buying books about the Shakur family as research for.
Draw your own conclusions on that.
Look, there were a lot of Shakurs. There
That's
were,
fair.
and a lot of them were very important and did wild things as well. Wild in a good way. Well, mostly.
But mostly good way.
Yeah.
Um, all right, Eli, buddy, thank you so much. Before we go, you know, promote the book. You did a little bit of that already.
Oh,
Both the current
yeah,
one
I
is
already
out,
did
the
that.
one that's coming out. I know, yeah, it's not out yet. But also, where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm on. Well, I mean, the best place I have my website is elijahkinchspector.com. Pretty easy if you can see my name here. But alternatively, I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on Instagram. I also have a newsletter called The Jewish Manticore, which is based on the name is based on a medieval thing from a bestiary. It's a whole thing. I wrote something about it that you can find if you go there. I think that's everything. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Well, check it out. Kalyna the Cutthroat, available on shelves November 26th. So now, if not soon, to it.
Basically
Eli,
now.
essentially now.
Yeah.
Also, not promoting us, but screw it. Play Suikoden 2 if you haven't already. It's so fucking good.
Oh
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah,
wait.
yeah.
Sorry. So real quick, I was away from video games for a while I was like finishing up on Kalyna the Cutthroat, and so I was like I don't even want to look at what's out. I don't even want to be paying attention because I want to play them. And so when I
Mhm.
finally, after months, opened up my Switch, that was when I learned there was a Suikoden 1 and 2 remaster because I hadn't
Y-
even been looking at game news because I didn't want to get tempted.
Oh, oh,
So it was an
wow.
incredible. Oh, I'm so excited.
Be great. And you're definitely going to be playing through it.
Oh yeah.
I'm so.
I may possibly my spouse will as well.
Good, good. The more people to play it, the better. To find
Mhm.
absolute reverence and love, hopefully help you enjoy. Not that you need the help, the Kalyna series of books as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. You can go ahead and find me at Boss Monster Kaiju on all socials that matter. Fuck you, Elon. You can also go ahead, like, and subscribe to the video because reasons that helps us out. The KaijuLounge.com website is up. And screw it, I've got this mug for sale. So, help me. Help me. Until then, Eli, thank you so much for being on. I love you. I don't say it enough, man, but I am fucking
I love you
proud
too.
of you for all this shit you've been able to accomplish. It's been absolutely awe-inspiring. Until next time, friends, stay cool, stay hip, stay heavy. Good night.